Caitlin Clark just delivered one of the best performances of her season. 27 points. 11 assists. A blowout win in front of a sold-out crowd in Indianapolis. And within hours, one of the biggest newspapers in America published something that had nothing to do with basketball at all. A national sports columnist compared the way Clark plays the game to a real-life tragedy from American history. A tragedy involving the murder of a 14-year-old boy. And she connected it directly to the fans who cheer for Clark every single night. Within minutes, the internet did not just react, it exploded. Sports journalists who rarely agree on anything suddenly found themselves on the same side. Fans who have argued about Clark for 2 years stopped arguing with each other and turned their attention somewhere else entirely. So here is the question worth asking tonight. How does one of the most respected sports outlets in the country end up publishing something this explosive about the most talked about athlete in women's sports? And why did that same outlet seem so eager to quietly change the story once the backlash started rolling in? Because that is the part nobody is really talking about yet. This is not just a story about one bad headline. This is a story about what happens when the biggest star in a sport becomes bigger than the sport itself. It is a story about who gets to control the narrative around Caitlin Clark, the league, the media, or Clark herself. And by the end of this video, you are going to understand something that most casual fans have completely missed. The real reason this controversy blew up was never really about basketball at all. But to understand how we got here, we have to go back to the exact moment this all started. Back to a single article, a single sentence, and a single decision that a newspaper is now scrambling to walk back. Let's start there. To understand why this exploded the way it did, you need to understand exactly how big Caitlin Clark has become in less than 2 years. She is not just a good player. She is the reason the WNBA is having the biggest financial year in the history of the league. Attendance records, broadcast records, merchandise records. All of it traces back to one rookie who turned women's basketball into must-see television. This season alone, she is averaging 21 points a game and nearly 8 assists a game. She has 10 career games with at least 25 points and 10 assists. That is a WNBA record. Not a rookie record. Not a franchise record. A league record in her second season. So when people say Clark changed the sport, that is not an exaggeration. That is a measurable fact. But here is the part that makes this story so complicated. The same intensity that made her a superstar has also made her a target. Clark plays with an edge. She talks back to opponents. She argues with referees. She has picked up 7 technical fouls this season, tied for the most in the entire league. And that edge has cost her physically. Earlier this season, veteran forward Alyssa Thomas was fined and suspended for putting her fist against Clark's throat during a game. Thomas later said she received death threats after that incident. Clark said very little publicly. She just kept playing. That detail matters because it shows you something important. This is not a player who runs from contact or complains for sympathy. She has been hit, targeted, and criticized more than almost any other athlete in the league. And her response has always been to let her performance speak for itself. So now picture the moment this article came out. A columnist at one of the largest newspapers in the country did not just criticize Clark's playing style. She used language connecting Clark's fans to extremist ideology, and she referenced a real historical tragedy involving the murder of a child, tying it to a debate about basketball technical fouls. Think about that combination for a second. A generational athlete already dealing with physical targeting on the court. A fan base already scrutinized more than any other fan base in women's sports. And now a major national platform appearing to suggest that cheering for her is somehow dangerous. That is not a small story. That is the kind of thing that makes former players, current broadcasters, and everyday fans stop scrolling and start typing. And that is exactly what happened. Now, if you are watching this and thinking, okay, but is this really as big a deal as people are making it out to be? Stick with me for the next few minutes. Because what comes next is not just outrage. It is a breakdown of exactly what was written, word for word, and why even people who have never been Caitlin Clark fans are calling this one of the worst things they have ever read in a major sports publication. Because once you hear the specifics, you will understand why an entire industry turned on one of its own. Let's start with the layer most people saw first. The comparison itself. The columnist argued that Clark's flopping and complaining to referees was not just annoying. She said it was becoming dangerous. And to make that argument, She brought up the murder of a 14-year-old boy in 1955. A real historical tragedy. A moment so painful it still defines conversations about racial violence in this country today. She linked that history to a debate about technical fouls in a basketball game. Now, ask yourself something. What kind of connection could possibly justify putting those two things in the same sentence? A superstar getting a little too vocal with referees, and one of the most horrifying crimes in American history. There is no basketball explanation that makes that comparison make sense. And that is layer 1 of why this spiraled so fast. Layer 2 is where it gets even messier. The same column suggested that Clark's fan base carries ties to extremist ideology. Not some fans. Not a small corner of social media. The fan base as a whole, painted with one broad brush. Think about who actually fills arenas to watch Clark play. Young girls wearing her jersey. College students who followed her from Iowa. Longtime women's basketball fans who finally have a reason to turn on the television every night. Grandparents who never watched a WNBA game in their life until she showed up. So when a national platform suggests that supporting her comes with a dangerous undertone, it does not just insult Clark. It insults millions of ordinary fans who have never done anything except buy a ticket and cheer. That is layer 2. And it is the layer that turned casual disagreement into real anger. Now here comes layer 3, and this is the one that made even neutral observers stop and take notice. This was not published on some random blog with no accountability. This came from one of the largest newspapers in the entire country. A place with editors. A place with fact-checkers. A place that is supposed to catch exactly this kind of thing before it ever reaches the public. So, the question every single journalist started asking was simple. How did this get through? One senior writer at a respected basketball outlet said publicly that he had never seen a section like this make it into a serious sports story. He said he genuinely could not understand how an editor allowed it to be published. Read that again. Not a random fan. Not an anonymous account. A veteran industry insider, someone who reports on this sport for a living, looking at this and saying he had no explanation for how it happened. And once people inside the industry started reacting that way, the story stopped being about Clark at all. It became a story about the newspaper itself. About editorial standards. About whether a major outlet had let personal opinion completely override basic judgment. That is when things really escalated. Commentators across the political spectrum, people who almost never agree on anything, suddenly found themselves saying the exact same thing. That this piece had gone too far. That whatever point the columnist was trying to make, the way she made it was indefensible. And here is where the problem starts to feel impossible to untangle. Because now you have 3 separate fires burning at once. You have Clark, who has done nothing except play basketball with intensity. You have millions of fans, suddenly lumped into a category they never asked to be part of. And you have a major newspaper, facing pressure from its own colleagues in the industry to explain itself. Nobody looks good in this situation. Not the columnist, who is now facing backlash from her own peers. Not the newspaper, who has to decide whether to defend her or distance themselves. And not the conversation around Clark herself, which keeps getting pulled further and further away from what actually happens on the court. So when the newspaper finally had to respond, you would think they would either stand firmly behind the piece or pull it completely. They did neither. And that decision, the one they landed on instead, is exactly what took this story from bad to something almost nobody saw coming. Here is what actually happened next, and it is the part almost nobody expected. The newspaper did not take the article down. They did not issue a full apology. Instead, they quietly edited it. They went back into the piece after publication and changed the wording, without a clear public explanation of exactly what was altered or why. Think about what that decision actually communicates. If the article was fair and accurate, why edit it at all? And if the article was wrong enough to require editing, why not admit that clearly and directly? That is the moment this story flips. Because up until now, the assumption was simple. A columnist made a bad call, and the newspaper would either own it or correct it. But quietly rewriting a published piece after backlash is neither of those things. It is something in between. And that in-between space is exactly where trust breaks down. The newspaper's communications team did respond publicly. They stated that the writer works as an opinion columnist, that her column is clearly labeled as opinion, and that it had been updated for clarity. Then they said they would not be commenting further. Read that response carefully. It does not say the comparison was appropriate. It does not say the comparison was wrong. It simply says the piece is opinion, and that it has been adjusted. That is not a defense. That is not an apology. That is a company trying to make a story disappear without actually resolving it. And that is when the columnist herself stepped in, posting her own explanation on social media. She admitted that her comparison was, in her words, not artfully done, but she also made clear that she still stood behind the core argument she was trying to make. So let's sit with that for a second. She acknowledged the specific comparison was a mistake, but she did not walk back the broader claim. The claim that Clark's playing style puts other players in the league at risk. This is the twist that changes how you have to look at this entire situation. Because now the controversy is not really about one clumsy sentence anymore. It is about whether there is a deeper narrative being pushed here. A narrative that frames Clark, one of the most fouled and physically targeted players in the league, as the one creating danger for everyone else. Flip that assumption for a moment. Clark is the player who has been elbowed, grabbed by the throat, and hit hard enough to draw suspensions against her opponents. Yet somehow, in this piece, she becomes the one accused of putting other players at risk. That inversion is the real story here. Not just a bad sentence about a historical tragedy. A framing that takes a player who has absorbed physical contact all season long and repositions her as the aggressor. And once you see that shift, you start to understand why so many people in the sports world reacted so strongly. Because this was not simply one writer making one mistake. This was a symptom of something larger. A pattern where Clark's competitiveness gets treated as a problem to be solved, while the physical treatment she receives on the court gets treated as background noise. So now the real question becomes bigger than one column. It becomes about how often this exact pattern has repeated itself around Clark, long before this article was ever published. And once we look at the evidence across this entire season, you will start to see a pattern too consistent to be a coincidence. Let's look at the pattern, piece by piece, because once you see it laid out, it becomes very hard to unsee. Start with what happened to Clark physically this season. During a game earlier in the year, veteran forward Alyssa Thomas pressed her fist directly against Clark's throat. The league reviewed it, fined Thomas, and suspended her for a game. That is not a borderline call. That is serious enough that the league itself treated it as a suspension-worthy offense. And what did Clark do in response? She did not go to the media demanding sympathy. She did not build a public campaign around being victimized. She simply kept playing. The story barely stayed in headlines for more than a few days before the conversation moved on. Now compare that to the most recent incident that started all of this. Clark picks up a technical foul for pointing toward the scoreboard during a 35-point blowout win. She is 35 points ahead. She gets jawed at by an opponent who tells her she is being locked up defensively. Clark's response is one word. Scoreboard. That's it. That's the moment. Not a shove, not a punch. Not language directed at anyone's safety. A competitive athlete pointing out that her team is dominating in the middle of a lopsided win. And yet, this is the moment that gets framed publicly as dangerous. Not the fist against her throat earlier in the season. Not the physical contact that led to an actual league suspension. A verbal exchange, during a blowout, about a scoreboard. When you place these two moments side by side, the inconsistency becomes impossible to ignore. Serious physical contact against Clark draws limited national conversation. A verbal taunt from Clark draws a national newspaper column comparing her to a historical tragedy. That is not a fair or balanced way to cover the same athlete across the same season. Now here is where it connects back to everything we talked about earlier. Clark responded to all of this criticism the same way she has responded to physical targeting all year. Directly, and without backing down. When asked about the risk of a suspension hanging over her after picking up her 7th technical foul, she said something worth hearing in full. She said she is never going to back down. She said she will try to control her emotions as best she can, but that the fire inside her is what makes her who she is. She said she has to find a balance with that. But she is not going to change who she is just because of the number hanging over her head. That is not the response of someone trying to create controversy. That is the response of a competitor who understands that her intensity is inseparable from her success. She is not apologizing for playing with fire. She is owning it. And when you place her response next to the newspaper's response, the contrast could not be sharper. Clark faced criticism and answered it directly, in her own words, without deflecting. The newspaper faced criticism and quietly edited a sentence without a clear explanation. One side owned their approach completely. The other side tried to smooth it over without fully admitting what went wrong. So here is where all of this evidence leads us. This was never really a story about one column, or one taunt, or one technical foul. It was a story about who gets held accountable, and who does not. Clark has been held accountable. Sometimes fairly, and sometimes not. Every single time she has stepped on the court this season. The question now is whether the same standard applies to everyone else covering her story. And that question is exactly where we have to land this conversation. So let's bring this all the way back to where we started. A superstar has one of the best nights of her season. Hours later, a national newspaper compares her competitiveness to a real historical tragedy and quietly edits the piece once the backlash becomes too loud to ignore. The columnist admits her wording was not artful, but she never walks back the core argument. And through all of it, Clark responds the exact same way she has responded to everything else this year. She does not back down, and she does not stop playing. That is the answer to the question we opened with. This was never really about basketball. It was about who controls the story around the most talked about athlete in women's sports right now. And every time someone has tried to control that story for her, Clark has answered the only way she knows how. On the court, with the ball in her hands. Here is what we know for certain moving forward. The newspaper has said it will not comment further. The columnist has said she stands by her core argument. And Clark still has 17 games left this season, sitting one technical foul away from an automatic suspension, carrying a fan base that just watched her name get dragged through a controversy that had almost nothing to do with the sport she plays. Nothing about this is finished. Not the tension between Clark and the media. Not the pressure building around every technical foul she picks up. Not the conversation about whether coverage of her has been fair from the very beginning of her career. So here is the real question worth sitting with after everything we just walked through. When the biggest star in a league keeps getting held to a different standard than everyone around her, is that scrutiny, or is it something else entirely? I want to know what you think. Drop your take in the comments, because this conversation is far from over, and there is a good chance the next chapter of this story is closer than anyone realizes. If you want to be here when it happens, this is exactly the kind of story we break down first. Subscribe now, so you do not miss what comes next.